So I came here to say that from the outset that the European Union clearly faces some substantial challenges in regard to housing deprivation and in regard to homelessness. Our work has found evidence of unavailability of affordable, adequate housing. Rising unemployment in the context of the economic crisis worsens the situation. Inadequate investment in social housing, segregation and discrimination against particular population groups, for example, ethnic minorities, migrants, or persons with disabilities. These are some of the issues that need to be urgently addressed. The Fundamental Rights Agency has often addressed the issue of housing and homelessness in its reports. Our reports are not done only by external contractors. We ourselves engage in the work very often. In one room of about 100 square meters, 144 people, men, women, and children, were held, huddled together for days, some of them for weeks, and some of them for months. A few weeks later, I met some of these people in flats in a city center in conditions that are difficult to be described. Nevertheless, this was in an EU member state. Recently, I visited, again in the context of our fieldwork, of a survey that we're carrying out, Roma families in Romania. I had the opportunity to enjoy their hospitality in a small makeshift hut as they used a small open fire to make tea, which was an experience that one would have expected to see perhaps in India or in Africa, but certainly not again in an EU member state. The European Commission and the Fundamental Rights Agency have repeatedly said that such examples of housing deprivation are unacceptable. Beyond shelter, however, and beyond the very basics and these horrible examples that I'm sure you've seen perhaps on television, or you can find some evidence even on YouTube, housing issues involve a rather complex set of other interrelated issues such as equal treatment, concerns about social integration, community cohesion, but also issues of social security, environmental sustainability, urban regeneration. The right to adequate housing, as has previously been stressed, is indeed enshrined in core international human rights instruments. At the European regional level, the European Social Charter protects the effective exercise of the right to housing, and the European Committee of Social Rights supervises the observance of the Social Charter. The successful Fencer complaint against France is well known, and I saw it was already distributed outside. But when we talk about the European Union, which is, let's say, a smaller area than the regional Europe covered by the Council of Europe, it is true that the EU does not have a clear legal competence on housing issues per se. Nevertheless, the Racial Equality Directive of 2000 makes a very specific and concrete reference to the application of the equal treatment principle, irrespective of racial or ethnic origin, in, quote, access to and supply of goods and services which are available to the public, including housing. The EU has also recently included the possibility to monitor housing rights obligations under Article 34.3 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's the third paragraph, which is important. And Article 31 of the revised European Social Charter, through the provisions of Regulation 763, which is on population and housing censuses. Now, in this way, Eurostat, the European Social Survey, and other instruments will be able to collect data. The EU acknowledges that housing as a core element of human dignity is an essential component of an advanced social protection system, such as one that should be applicable throughout the EU. And therefore, we expect that this will lead to a more systematic monitoring across the EU through the collection of comparable statistical data that can provide evidence about the fulfillment of the rights holders' entitlements and, of course, the duty bearers' obligations. Now, monitoring housing rights, in particular homelessness, effectively is particularly important today because we see daily evidence that the economic crisis, which continues to affect severely, in particular certain member states, such as my own country of origin, Greece, but also Italy, Spain, Portugal, and others, translates more and more into a growing housing crisis of significant proportions. It affects increasingly vulnerable population groups, such as migrants. It affects persons with disabilities. It affects indigenous minorities. It affects, however, more and more what I would call mainstream families, so people who have lost their homes because they're incapable of paying their mortgage, keeping up with their mortgage payments. This problem was also highlighted in October of 2011 in an opinion of the European Economic and Social Committee on the problem of homelessness. As I said before, housing issues are of particular concern to our agency. The FRA is mandated to provide EU institutions and member states with evidence-based advice. And to this end, we collect secondary data, but we also carry out independent qualitative and large-scale quantitative survey research and publish reports and our opinions. The scope of the agency's work is defined every 5 years by the Council of the European Union through a multi-annual framework. The next multi-annual framework is about to be decided this year, and of course it's up to the member states to decide whether social and economic rights will be included. This would give us a direct mandate to work more broadly on housing issues. The current multi-annual framework, valid from 2007 until 2012, does not include social and economic rights per se. So our work on housing issues to date is mainly done through the perspective of equal treatment and non-discrimination. In addition, since the EU has become itself party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we started already 2 years ago to collect more systematically data on housing issues linked to the right of persons with disabilities, as you said before, to independent living, namely their right to choose and control where and with whom to live, to put it more simply. The results of our work are presented in our annual reports, but we have also published specific thematic reports which you might find interesting. Since 2006, the first report was on the housing situation of migrants and minorities, and in 2009 we produced a report on Roma and traveller housing. Both of these reports were based on an analysis of secondary material. Next month, however, we will publish key statistical data on housing based on a large-scale survey that we carried out in close collaboration with the UNDP and the World Bank, with the United Nations Development Programme and the World Bank, on the socio-economic situation of Roma and non-Roma living nearby. The survey covers 11 EU member states, including for the first time so-called old member states, such as Greece, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. On June 7th, we will also publish the results of qualitative fieldwork research that examine the experiences of persons with intellectual disabilities and persons with mental health problems on choice and control in independent living. What does the work of the agency, what I've just described, show? Well, it shows that across the EU, basic housing rights of many migrants and members of ethnic minorities, in particular Roma and travellers, are not fulfilled. Many live in poor housing conditions which contribute to entrenched patterns of social and economic inequality as a result of persistent, extensive and varied forms of housing discrimination in terms both of location segregation, as well as tenure. In addition, we have repeatedly highlighted that the increasing deregulation of segments of the housing market has impacted negatively on the already fragile and unprotected housing situation of immigrant workers and ethnic minorities, particularly the Roma. The housing policies of EU member states in regard to social integration differ very significantly. Tentatively, they could be grouped into two very broad groups, very broad clusters. The first consisting of countries where state intervention has been used more systematically to reduce housing exclusion through the allocation of social housing. In this cluster, state intervention is a continuous mechanism, balancing market prices and housing affordability. But a large group of member states belongs to the second cluster, where integration policies have been haphazardly managed, or where social housing provision is limited, or even, as in my own country, basically non-existent. Where lack of social housing is combined with high market prices, persons belonging to particularly vulnerable groups, such as migrants or persons with disabilities, are either forced to live in substandard conditions, live in institutions, in particular when measures are taken to specifically exclude them from provision of social services. That sounds rather odd, but let me give you one example of such an exclusion. In a requirement proposed by the Friuli-Venezia Giulia region in Italy for migrants to meet specific housing standards not asked of Italian citizens if they are to be registered in the municipal registry of residence. One requirement to register is certification from a municipality or from a local health unit that their living accommodation is of a minimum area of habitable space relative to the number of residents in that unit. Social services are usually granted on the basis of this registration. Those third country nationals who are not able to comply with these standards could very well be excluded from access to any social housing and rent subsidies. The Italian equality body, UNA, issued an opinion stating that requiring citizenship or many years of residence for access to public services in this way constitutes discrimination on grounds of citizenship. And in April of 2011, the European Commission actually began infringement proceedings with regard to laws in that particular region that make access to public housing dependent on a number of years of residence or in other ways give preferential treatment to Italian citizens compared to other country nationals. Another example of legislative developments affecting housing concerns Hungary. And there, according to amended legislation in force since December 2011, individuals habitually residing in public places could be fined about €500 or be imprisoned. Let me briefly turn to Roma and travelers and stress that their housing situation has for long been of particular concern. Across the EU, many Roma continue to live in inadequate housing conditions, often in segregated settlements, with substandard infrastructure or in shanty towns, and are often victims of eviction. Examples are, especially in the past, various gentrification projects in inner city areas in Central and Eastern European countries. Housing conditions have been shown to affect other areas such as education, work, health, resulting in an entrapment in a cycle of poverty and social exclusion. The results of the survey, which I mentioned before, which are expected to become public at the end of May, together when the Commission will present them together with its communication. I will only give you one figure of those results. Show, for instance, that 40% of all the Roma surveyed, and we're talking about more than 80,000, lived in households that lacked at least one of the following basic amenities: an indoor kitchen, an indoor toilet, an indoor shower or bath, and electricity. In addition, on average, at least two persons share one room in the overwhelming majority of the Roma households surveyed, in contrast to their non-Roma neighbors. Roma living in informal settlements or on land that they do not own lack security of tenure across the EU. The lack of adequate recognition of tenure leads directly to threats of forced eviction, which in cases of non-nationals may also involve actions to remove them from the country, as was the case with Romanian Roma in France in 2010, earlier in Italy, and so on. In response to growing concerns about the increasing exclusion and marginalization of Roma communities, the European Commission released in April of 2011 its landmark communication on an EU framework for national Roma integration strategies. They linked the need to tackle poverty and exclusion directly for the first time with the protection and promotion of fundamental rights, putting social inclusion within a rights dimension. The communication, and it's important to note it in this conference, identifies housing as one of the 4 core areas for Roma integration and set a specific target for member states to achieve by the end of the Europe 2020 growth strategy period, aiming at closing the gap between the share of Roma with access to housing and to public utilities and that of the rest of the population. This is, in my view, a very serious statement. At the same time, the Commission highlighted that Member States should use the EU structural funds in implementing housing actions, especially since May 2010, the amended regulation on the European Regional Development Fund, well-known RDF, extends housing interventions to the renovation of houses in rural areas and the replacement of houses in both urban and rural areas. The right to adequate housing includes many elements, for example, access to energy for cooking, heating, lighting, sanitation, refuse disposal, washing, cooking, bathing facilities, clean drinking water, access to public transport, emergency services, and so on. Many of these elements have a very specific disability dimension that member states who have ratified the CRPD will soon need to tackle carefully and take it carefully into account when designing housing policies or redesigning their housing policies to make them compatible with the CRPD. For example, in a disability context, access to energy might need to include access to fail-safe systems of alternative power. It's possible that cooking and bathing facilities must be fully physically accessible to persons with disabilities. More space may be necessary to accommodate related equipment or assistance. Needless to add that public transport and the built environment as a whole must also be fully accessible. Housing for persons with disabilities, in particular as regards people with intellectual or so-called learning disabilities or people with mental health problems, must be provided within the community, close to personal relationship networks and other sources of formal and informal support. In accordance with the CRPD, persons with disabilities should be given as much as possible the options to freely choose where and with whom they will live. In closing, let me just add that housing, and in particular homelessness, as I said at the start, remains a challenge for the EU's track record on equal treatment. In their efforts to improve social integration and community cohesion, many EU member states have taken steps to address these issues, but clearly there's still much that needs to be done. The Fundamental Rights Agency will continue conducting its research, collecting data, and providing this evidence-based advice to assist the EU and its member states to improve the situation. Thanks very much.